Someone says something offhand, a tone of voice, a message that doesn't come back. And just like that, your entire day collapses. You tell yourself, it's nothing. You tell yourself, you're overreacting. But the feeling doesn't care what you tell it. It moves in, sits down, and starts running the show. Your mood, your focus, your sense of who you are, all of it handed over to someone who probably wasn't even thinking about you. And the worst part? It keeps happening. Different people, different situations, same result. Your boss's disapproval hollows you out. Your partner's distance sends you into a quiet panic. A stranger's comment at the wrong moment, and something inside you buckles. You adapt your personality depending on who's in the room. You read the temperature before you speak. You perform, adjust, monitor, endlessly, trying to keep the world in a configuration that allows you to feel okay. You've probably told yourself the solution is to care less, to grow thicker skin, to be more confident, as if the problem was simply that you feel too much or that you need better armor. Jung would tell you that diagnosis is completely wrong. After decades of working with the human psyche, not theories about it, but the actual, living, irrational, terrifying machinery of it, Carl Jung arrived at a conclusion that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. You are not being controlled by other people. You are being controlled by parts of yourself that you have projected onto other people. The person who has power over your emotions is not wielding that power. You gave it to them, unconsciously, precisely because something in them reflects something in you that you have refused to face. This is not a comforting idea. It's not meant to be. Because what it implies is that the problem was never out there, and neither is the solution. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly how this mechanism works, why it runs so deep, and what it actually costs you to leave it unexamined, not as a concept, as your life. The specific, recognizable shape of your emotional reactions, your dependencies, your collapses. But be warned, what Jung is asking of you is not self-improvement. It is something far harder and far more necessary. He is asking you to look at what you have hidden from yourself, and to stop pretending you don't know it's there. Most people assume that emotional dependency is a personality flaw, that some people are just more sensitive, more needy, more fragile, and that the solution is to toughen up, to want less, to need less from others. That assumption protects you from a much more unsettling truth. Jung observed that the majority of people live what he called a psychologically outside-in existence. Identity, self-worth, emotional stability. None of it generated from within. All of it contingent. When you are approved of, accepted, successful, you feel solid. When you are criticized, rejected, or overlooked, something in you gives way. Not bends, gives way. The floor disappears, and you are briefly, terrifyingly, nobody. This is not sensitivity. This is a structure, and structures have architecture. What you have built, without knowing you were building it, is a psychological arrangement in which your center of gravity lives outside of you, in other people's opinions, in their approval, their attention, their validation, which means you are never actually stable. You are only ever as stable as the last thing someone said about you, or didn't say, or the way they looked at you across a room. You handed the controls to an external world that has no interest in holding them carefully. Jung was precise about what this costs. A person whose emotional equilibrium depends entirely on external conditions is not living. They are managing. Every interaction becomes a calculation. Every relationship becomes a negotiation for the validation that keeps the flaw from disappearing. And because no external source can ever provide that stability permanently, the management never ends. You are always one wrong comment away from collapse. The cruelty of this arrangement is that it feels normal. It feels like just how people work, because almost everyone around you is doing the same thing. You have all quietly agreed to regulate each other's sense of self, to keep the whole architecture standing through mutual approval and performance. And the moment someone withdraws from that agreement, even accidentally, the structure shakes. What Jung is pointing to is not a wound you need to heal. It is a center of gravity you never built. And until you build it, inside yourself, from your own substance, you will remain exactly where you are, emotionally at the mercy of a world that was never designed to hold you. So the question becomes, where did this architecture come from? Why do certain people have a power over your emotions that is completely disproportionate to who they actually are? The answer lies not in them, but in what you have placed inside them without realizing it. And that is where we go next. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. The people who provoke your most intense reactions are not random. The irritation that lingers for hours, the contempt that surprises even you, the rage that feels personal before you've had time to think, that intensity is not about them. It is a signal, and it is pointing inward. This is Jung's concept of shadow projection. The shadow is not simply your dark side. It is everything you have disowned. Every quality you decided was unacceptable and compressed out of conscious awareness. The rage you learned to swallow. The selfishness you were taught to be ashamed of. The weakness you buried because weakness was dangerous. None of it disappeared. It went underground, accumulated pressure, and has been waiting ever since for a face to attach itself to. When it finds one, the reaction is immediate and disproportionate. Someone is arrogant, and it doesn't just bother you. It infuriates you in a way that lingers. Someone is needy, and your contempt feels almost personal. Normal irritation passes. Projected shadow catches fire. Jung was precise about what this means. In the Undiscovered Self, he observed how readily human beings locate evil, weakness, and fault in others, and how this outward gaze is not moral clarity, but psychological evasion. Our fiercest judgments are autobiographical. The qualities that provoke your most visceral reactions are the ones most intimately connected to what you have rejected in yourself. The shadow does not only contain what is dark, it contains everything the ego has decided is incompatible with its self-image. If your identity is built around being calm and rational, your own anger lives in the shadow, and you will be inexplicably disturbed by people who express anger openly. If your self-image depends on being selfless, your own self-interest lives in the shadow, and the selfishness of others will provoke something that goes well beyond simple discomfort. You are not seeing them clearly. You are seeing yourself, refracted. Jung insisted this is not metaphor. It is a precise description of how psychic energy moves. When something is expelled from consciousness, it migrates. It finds a host. And as long as it remains projected, you are dependent on that host. Every encounter with them is an encounter with the part of yourself you have refused to integrate. This is why certain people have a hold on you that makes no rational sense. The intellect knows their opinion shouldn't matter this much. The shadow is not listening to the intellect. The only way to reduce another person's power over your emotional state is to withdraw the projection. Not by deciding to care less. That is suppression, and it increases the pressure. But by turning toward what the reaction is pointing at. By asking, with genuine honesty, what is this person showing me about myself that I have not been willing to look at? That question is not comfortable, but it is the only one that moves anything. Because as long as your shadow lives in other people, they will keep controlling you. Not because they have power over you, but because you placed your own power inside them and forgot you did it. Shadow projection, however, is only one mechanism at work. There is another, subtler, and in many ways more devastating. The one that makes you feel genuinely whole when a specific person approves of you, and genuinely destroyed when they don't. That is not the projection of what you have rejected. That is the projection of what you most need to become. And that is where we go next. There is a particular kind of emotional collapse that feels different from ordinary hurt. It is not the sting of criticism or the friction of conflict. It is the specific devastation of losing someone you had placed at the center of your world, a partner, a mentor, a figure whose approval made you feel, briefly but completely, like you were enough. When that person withdraws, the pain is not proportional to the relationship. It is total. And you cannot understand why something that was supposed to be about another person feels like the loss of yourself. Jung could tell you exactly why. Because it was never entirely about them. This is the mechanism Jung called the projection of the self, distinct from shadow projection, and in many ways more seductive. The self, in Jungian psychology, is not the ego. It is the totality of what you are and what you are capable of becoming. The integrated whole that most people spend their lives approaching but never fully inhabiting. It is the psychological completeness that individuation, Jung's term for the lifelong process of becoming who you truly are, slowly builds toward. And because that work is difficult and largely unconscious, the psyche finds a shortcut. It projects that wholeness onto another person. The person you idealize is not who you think they are. They are a screen. Onto them, you have cast the qualities you have not yet developed in yourself. The confidence you don't trust yourself to have. The freedom you haven't permitted yourself. The wholeness you sense is possible, but haven't reached. When they validate you, something deeper than pride responds. It feels like completion. Like finally being seen, not just by them, but by the part of yourself that lives inside them. When they reject you, the collapse is equally total, because you haven't lost a person. You have lost the part of yourself you were storing in them. Jung observed this pattern with particular clarity in romantic relationships, but it extends far beyond romance. The mentor, whose criticism undoes you entirely. The authority figure whose approval you pursue with an urgency that embarrasses you. The friend whose perception of you feels more real than your own. In each case, the dynamic is the same. You have outsourced your psychological completeness to someone else's body and called it love, or admiration, or respect. What it actually is, Jung would say, is dependency dressed in the language of connection. In the Undiscovered Self, Jung returned repeatedly to the danger of locating one's psychological foundation outside oneself, in institutions, in ideologies, in the mass, in the state. The same principle operates at the intimate scale. Any time you construct your sense of wholeness around an external figure, you have made that figure into a kind of god. And gods, when they fail you, as every human being eventually will, do not simply disappoint, they annihilate. Because what collapses is not your relationship with them. It is the architecture of your self-worth, which you built on ground that was never yours to build on. This is why the intensity of certain rejections cannot be talked down with reason. Your friends tell you this person was not right for you, that you will find someone better, that your worth is not determined by their opinion. And you know they are right. You know it with your entire conscious mind. And it changes nothing, because the wound is not in your conscious mind. It is in the place where you had deposited something essential about yourself, and that place is now empty. The path out of this is not to stop idealizing, to become more guarded, more cynical, more defended against the possibility of placing too much in another person. That is just another way of avoiding the actual work. The path is to begin developing internally what you have been seeking externally. To ask, with real seriousness, what is it about this person that makes me feel complete in their presence? What quality, what freedom, what wholeness am I seeing in them that I have not yet claimed as my own? Because whatever the answer is, that is yours. It was always yours. You simply hadn't built it yet, and so you borrowed it from someone else's image. Jung called the goal individuation, the slow, unglamorous process of becoming a whole person, not through the accumulation of relationships or achievements or validations, but through the integration of everything you have projected outward back into yourself. A person who has done even a portion of this work does not stop loving or admiring others, but they stop needing those others to hold their center. They can be rejected without being destroyed because what they value most about themselves is no longer living in someone else's keeping. But there is still another layer beneath this one. Because even when you are not projecting your shadow onto someone, and even when you are not projecting your ideal self onto someone, there is still the mask. The identity you constructed for the world to approve of, and the catastrophic fragility that lives just behind it. That is where we go next. At some point, you stopped performing for the world and started believing the performance. The competent professional, the good person, the reliable one, the one who has it together. You built that image carefully over years in response to what the world seemed to reward and what it seemed to punish. And it worked. People responded to the mask. They approved of it, promoted it, loved it. So gradually, without noticing, you moved inside it. You stopped being the person wearing the mask and became the mask itself. Jung called this the persona, the social face we construct to navigate the world. And he was careful to say that a persona is not pathological. Every human being needs one. The problem is not having a mask. The problem is forgetting that you are wearing one. When you identify completely with your persona, your entire sense of self becomes contingent on its maintenance. Your value as a person is not something you feel internally. It is something the mask earns repeatedly through performance and approval. Which means every threat to the mask is experienced as a threat to your existence, not metaphorically, psychologically. When someone criticizes the competent professional, it is not the professional who feels attacked. It is you, the whole of you, because there is no longer any distance between the role and the person playing it. This is why a single comment can detonate an entire day. Not because the comment was devastating in itself, but because it landed on a persona so inflated, so fused with identity, that any crack in the surface feels like structural collapse. Jung observed that the more rigid and elaborated the persona, the more fragile the psyche behind it, because all the energy that should be building genuine inner substance has been redirected into maintaining the appearance. The mask grows thicker. The person behind it grows thinner. And the thinner they grow, the more desperately the mask must be protected. In The Undiscovered Self, Jung described the modern individual as someone increasingly shaped by collective categories, by what the state, the institution, the social group demands. The persona is the psychological expression of this pressure. It is the self that was sculpted by external expectation rather than internal development. And because it was built for others, it requires others to sustain it. Their approval is not flattering. It is structural. Remove it, and the whole construction shudders. You can recognize this in yourself by noticing what kinds of criticism you cannot metabolize. Not criticism in general. Everyone finds some criticism difficult, but the specific variety that targets the image you have most invested in. Tell a person who has built their persona around intelligence that their reasoning is sloppy, and watch what happens. Tell someone whose persona is built around kindness that they were selfish in a particular moment. The reaction will be disproportionate, defensive, sometimes furious, not because the criticism was necessarily wrong, but because it touched the load-bearing wall, the one thing they cannot afford to have questioned, because without it, they do not know who they are. This is the hidden cost of living through a persona. It does not just make you emotionally dependent on approval. It makes you a stranger to yourself, because the self that the world sees and validates is not quite you. It is a curated version of you, assembled from acceptable parts. And the parts that were not acceptable, The ones that didn't fit the image were pushed into the shadow, projected outward, or simply suppressed into silence. Over time, the distance between the mask and the actual person widens into something that feels, in quiet moments, like a profound and nameless loneliness. You are surrounded by people who approve of you, and none of them know you. Jung's answer to this was not to dismantle the persona. That would be psychologically reckless, a collapse into undifferentiated chaos. The answer is to develop enough inner substance that the persona becomes what it was always meant to be. A functional interface with the world, worn consciously, rather than an identity you have no choice but to defend. That requires building something real behind the mask. A self that does not need constant external confirmation because it has genuine internal ground to stand on. But even this does not reach the deepest layer. Because beneath the inflated persona, beneath the projected shadow, beneath the idealized figures who hold your sense of completeness, there is something older, a wound that predates all of it. One that has been quietly determining your choices, your relationships, and your emotional reactions since long before you were old enough to name it. That is where we go next. If what you're hearing resonates with you, you'll find real value in my ebooks. Beyond the Shadow breaks down Jung's core ideas, while Dialogues with the Unconscious gives you a 30-day path to apply them in your life. Both are linked in the pinned comment. There is a particular kind of person whose disapproval undoes you completely. Not just anyone, a specific category, the authority figure, the boss whose opinion of your work feels like a verdict on your worth as a human being, the older partner whose emotional distance sends you into a quiet spiral, the mentor who withholds praise and somehow, inexplicably, that withholding feels like the most important thing in the world. You know, rationally, that their approval should not carry this weight. And yet it does, every time, with a consistency that should tell you something. It is telling you something. It is telling you that you are not actually in the present moment with these people. You are somewhere much older. Jung identified what he called the parental imago, the internalized psychological image of the parent, formed in early childhood and carried forward into adult life with extraordinary fidelity. This is not simply memory. It is a living psychic structure, a template through which certain relationships are experienced, certain figures are perceived, certain wounds are repeatedly activated. The child who never received consistent approval from a critical father does not grow up and leave that need behind. They grow up and begin searching for it everywhere else, in bosses, in mentors, in romantic partners who carry the same emotional signature. The search is unconscious. The hunger is not. What makes this mechanism so difficult to detect is precisely that it does not feel like the past. It feels like the present. When your manager's criticism lands with the weight of a judgment on your entire existence, it does not arrive with a label that says, "This is your father's voice." It arrives as reality, as an accurate assessment of your value. The emotional intensity is so immediate, so convincing, that it bypasses reflection entirely. You are a grown adult with decades of experience and evidence of your own competence, and a single dismissive comment from the right kind of person reduces you, in an instant, to someone much younger and much more frightened. Jung was unsparing about the cost of this. In the Undiscovered Self, he returned repeatedly to the idea that the individual who has not examined their own psychological depths is not a free agent. They are being directed by forces they cannot see, making choices that feel like preferences but are actually compulsions, drawn toward situations and people that recreate the emotional conditions of their earliest and most formative experiences, not because they want to suffer, but because the psyche, in its strange and relentless logic, keeps returning to the unfinished, keeps presenting the original wound in new costumes, hoping that this time, finally, it will be resolved. It never is, not that way, because the person in front of you, the boss, the partner, the authority figure, is not the one who created the wound. They cannot heal it. They can only trigger it. And every time they do, and every time you collapse or rage or contort yourself, trying to earn what they're withholding, you are not solving the problem. You are feeding it. You are giving the wound another vote in your present life. This is what Jung meant when he spoke of the unconscious directing life and being called fate. The person who has not done this work does not experience their emotional reactions as the residue of unexamined history. They experience them as responses to current reality. They believe they are simply someone who needs a lot of reassurance, or someone who has bad luck with authority figures, or someone who keeps falling for emotionally unavailable partners. They do not see the pattern because they are inside it. The wound has been voting in every significant relationship they have ever had, and they have been calling those votes free will. The recognition of this is not by itself liberation. Knowing that your reaction to your manager is entangled with your relationship to a parent does not make the reaction disappear, but it creates something that did not exist before. Distance. A sliver of space between the trigger and the collapse. Enough space to ask whether the intensity of what you are feeling belongs to this moment or to a much older one. Enough space, eventually, to stop handing the present over to the past. That space, small at first and hard-won, is where autonomy actually begins. Not in the decision to care less, not in the performance of indifference, but in the slow and unglamorous work of reclaiming what the wound has been spending on your behalf. Which brings us, finally, to the only question that matters. What does it actually mean to take all of this back? Everything we have covered points to the same place. The shadow you project onto others, the wholeness you deposit in people you idealize, the mask fused with your identity, the wound casting votes in your present life. These are not separate problems. They are different faces of the same condition, a self-built almost entirely from the outside in, dependent on external sources for what can only be generated internally. Jung had a word for the opposite of this. He called it individuation. Individuation is not a technique. It is the lifelong process of becoming genuinely yourself. Not the self assembled from others' expectations, not the self the wound constructed to stay safe, not the self the persona performs for approval, but the actual, integrated person you are when nothing external is propping you up. Jung considered it the central task of human psychological development. And he was honest about what it costs. You have to face everything you have spent your life organizing your existence around not facing. This is the hardest truth this video has been building toward. You are not emotionally controlled by other people because you are weak or damaged. You are emotionally controlled because you have outsourced your center. Piece by piece, through projection and idealization and unexamined wounds, you have distributed the most essential parts of yourself into the external world, into other people's opinions, their approval, their perception of who you are. And you have been living at the mercy of whether or not it comes back to you. Withdrawing that energy, reclaiming it, integrating it, is not something that happens through insight alone. Understanding this intellectually moves nothing. What moves the structure is the repeated, uncomfortable practice of catching yourself in the moment of projection and refusing the automatic response. Sitting with the discomfort of not performing, not adapting, not contorting yourself into whatever shape the room requires. It is slow. It is not linear. It is never finished. But here is what Jung observed about people who do even a portion of this work. They become harder to destroy. Not because they stop feeling. They often feel more as the defended layers come down. But because what they feel no longer has the power to erase them. Criticism hurts and is examined for whatever truth it contains and then released. Rejection hurts and is grieved and does not become a verdict. The approval of others becomes genuinely pleasant rather than structurally necessary. In the Undiscovered Self, Jung argued that the individual who has found their own psychological ground becomes, in a precise sense, free. Not free from pain, but free from the specific tyranny of needing the external world to configure itself in a particular way in order to feel that they exist. That freedom is not given. It is built, slowly, from materials that were always yours, but that you had placed in other people's keeping. The question this video leaves you with is not comfortable. Where, right now, is your center of gravity living? In your own values, your own knowledge of who you are, or in the shifting, unreliable responses of the world around you? If it is outside you, and if you recognized yourself anywhere in this video, it almost certainly is. What are you prepared to do about that? The wound does not wait. And every day you spend living from the outside in is another day the most essential parts of you remain in other people's keeping. If this opens something in you, stay with that discomfort. Don't resolve it too quickly. And if you want to go further, the next video is waiting.